see here. All right, so we're recording.
Okay.
All right, cool. So Tracy, so first of all, I just want to start by thanking you for joining my class.
Sure.
And so the class is for English teachers around the whole country. It's an online class, and I think there's about 18 students in it, and doing phenomenal work. We just started reading and starting to talk about this
Great.
book, and
Yeah.
so it's so great to be able to talk to some of the authors.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for
Yeah.
having me.
Yeah, of course. So can you tell us just a little bit about who you are, where you're
Yeah.
teaching, a little bit about your background, things like that?
Yeah. So I teach at one of the original alternative high schools, dating back to 1972, and it's in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's called Community High. It is on a lottery system, but that there's no test for students to get in. They just have to put their name in the hat, and anybody can come. So there's no entrance test. We just found out yesterday at our staff meeting that out of all the schools in Michigan, we're number one for SAT for schools that don't require an entrance exam. But what's
Nice.
interesting about our school is that we don't teach any AP classes, we don't
Hmm.
teach any IB, we don't teach any track classes. So my English classes have students who are 14 years old and coming into high school with an IEP and special education services. And then somebody sits next to them who's 18 years old, who's applying to Harvard. So it's a real mix of
Nice.
kids, and the philosophy is to put everyone together and
Mhm.
everyone can learn from each other. So it's kind of ironic that we are a school that doesn't do AP or IB or any of the advanced track,
Mhm.
but yet we still have the highest test scores.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful place. But I started teaching 23 years ago in a rural community, and when I moved to community, people would always say, "Oh, you can do that because you're at community."
Mhm.
But I do believe that teachers, no matter where you're at, that you have control over your classroom to the extent that you take advantage of control that you have over your classroom.
Mhm.
So that I don't teach radically differently than I at community high, because it's an alternative school versus teaching at Pinckney High School, which was a more traditional high school. That
Mhm.
teaching in my classroom is the same. And I think from a very young age, I think when I was 20 years old, I worked at a Montessori school for a
Mhm.
summer. And that's really when I started to think about choice in the classroom and how students can be leaders in the classroom. And I have a website that I started this summer, because I really wanted, I advise newspaper, and a lot of journalism advisors find themselves alone because
Mhm.
they're the only one in the school who's doing it. It's a big job. So I created a website basically that just shares teacher materials that I have with
Mhm.
Google and Google Docs, so that people can go into it, they can copy it, they can put their name on it, they can change it, and then they can use it. And then I
Mhm.
also do some thinking about what happened the week before in my classroom and what kind of stands out. And then I do in context grammar
Mhm.
um, lessons using New York Times. But I guess what on the website I have a quote by Maria Montessori, and
Mm.
it basically says that it's when the children are busy and they don't need the teacher, that that is the greatest degree of
Mm.
success.
Mhm.
And I always feel like I'm trying to get my students to a place where they don't need me,
Mhm.
where my classroom can run. And honestly, like, there was a day last year where I took kids on a field trip, and the sub didn't end up going through because it was my fault. I didn't end up calling in a sub, but my classes ran, and I teach 100-minute blocks,
Mhm.
and my classes ran all day. And it was in my third block that one of the students went down to get attendance to help me out since there was no teacher. And the secretary was like, what do you mean? Like, there's Tracy's not here. There's no teacher. But the classes ran all day
Mhm.
without me. And
Hmm.
to me, philosophically and pedagogically, like, that's always the place that I'm trying to get to.
Mhm.
Um, whether or not, you really ever get there, because I do think that teachers are necessary, and really the more student centered a classroom is, in
Mhm.
order to keep it from being on the brink of chaos, right?
Mhm.
You need to have it be productive. Is that teachers, I think, have to have a really solid understanding of how to structure a student centered classroom.
Mhm.
right? And it's not chaotic at all.
Mhm.
But
And
so anyway,
it takes
that's
real,
me.
yeah, it takes real intentionality from the beginning of the year to establish that.
Yeah, and in the structure of it and the things that happen in the background,
Mhm.
with kind of pulling out student leaders. Like I'm meeting with students tomorrow at lunch and we're lesson planning together next
Mm.
week. So
Mhm.
I'll say, what lessons do you think need to be taught to the new kids? And what are we going to do? Who's going to teach it? How are we going to
Mhm.
lead? How do we want to structure the time?
Mhm.
So
Nice.
bringing them into it.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. I like it a
Yeah.
lot.
So tell us about the chapter that you wrote for this book with Molly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, the chapter that I wrote was like the easiest professional writing I've ever done
Uh-huh.
because it was just telling the story of my students.
Mhm.
And it happened, that there was a student's father who was about to be deported, went to Detroit to check in.
Mhm.
And she ended up coming into our classroom and said, somebody needs to help, right? Somebody needs to do something. So then my student journalists immediately stepped up and they were the first ones to go to the house, right? And I talked my students through it. I said, this is going to be really hard
Mhm.
to enter into the house, to sit with the family, to hear the story. And then the communicator story went viral in
Mhm.
Ann Arbor. It was cool because we could see actually kind of around the world and we watched the analytics. So we were watching
Mm.
it because we all put it up on Facebook and then we
Mhm.
just watched for an hour and watched
Wow.
it spread from place to place around the country. And actually around the world, right? Because then
Mm.
it would hop overseas and
Mhm.
then you would see it kind of blossom over there. But it really motivated people in our area to come to the rally, to speak up, to raise awareness about it. And he ended
Mhm.
up not being deported.
Hmm.
And I would like to think that the article and the engagement had some degree of influence in that.
Mhm.
And I think, I mean, that brings up another thing is that as a teacher, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, but to try to figure out how you get kids to put their work into the world,
Mhm.
right? And we talk about sometimes in kind of like in an ELA, right, in the English teacher world about this authentic audience. And so
Mhm.
often, an authentic audience in a teacher's perspective is like everyone's going to write a poem and then read it, and we're going to invite parents in, and 10
Mhm.
parents are going to show up, and we're going to have cookies and lemonade. But that's not an authentic audience, right? Like,
Mhm.
authentic audience to me is like that day watching that article spread on
Mhm.
social media and watching the analytics, right, go
Mhm.
from 0 to 15,000 in the course of an hour. That's an authentic audience, right?
Mhm.
That their work has purpose and meaning in the world.
Mhm.
Can we always do that as teachers? No. But I think that we need to set up more and more opportunities,
Mhm.
especially with online,
With
you
social
know,
media and online outlets and things like
yeah,
that. Yeah.
with social media, the internet, letting kids understand how to build out a website.
Mhm.
And I think the problem is that sometimes teachers don't know how to build out a website. So
Right.
how do we really radically change how it is that we teach and the
Mhm.
body of knowledge that we have to keep
Right.
up with where kids are at right now
Mhm.
and the possibilities?
So was this article that you, or the chapter that you wrote, was that from a journalism class?
Yeah, it was from a journalism class.
So what thoughts do you have about how could, because the most of the teachers in my class are English language arts teachers. So they're teaching
Yeah,
English 9, English 10.
yeah,
What are ways they could sort of think about this, what you're doing here,
yeah,
in the context of those curricula?
yeah. One thing that I would totally 100% say is that if their school doesn't have a journalism program,
Mhm.
it should.
Mm.
Journalism aligns, like, it's crazy, right? Because you have ninth grade English, 10th grade English, 11th grade
Mhm.
English, and then you have 21st century skills, right? And then
Mhm.
you have the SAT, and you have the grammar on the SAT and the writing on the SAT. Grammar on SAT, writing on the SAT, and then the 21st century skills all align absolutely perfectly with a journalism curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And journalism curriculum, it is, I mean, I think that that's where we need to be at. We need to
Mm-hmm.
teach kids how to do research, primary research, secondary research, how to put their voices out into the world. Right now, I'm focused with my students on Instagram stories,
Mm-hmm.
and how to really use Instagram as a
Mm-hmm.
powerful journalism tool.
Right.
But I mean, if you think about journalism, you have narrative in there, you have
Mm-hmm.
argumentative writing, you have
Mm-hmm.
research, you have
That's right.
features, you have all of these things. So I think that one, I mean, my first thing would be to say, really think seriously about bringing journalism
Mm-hmm.
to your school, because it
Mm-hmm.
matters. And we have to train that next generation of journalists, but also that like my students come back from taking the SAT and they're like, I got a 35 on the grammar, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's
It's
and they
embedded
say
in the curriculum already.
it is, and they just say that they were just pretending like they were editing articles. Like when we
Mm-hmm.
edit articles, we edited narratives the other day. So we started off with narrative writing in journalism, and this is a good example of how you could bring this into a regular
Mm-hmm.
class curriculum. Is that we started off with narrative writing, which is really kind of everywhere, right? And we read Amy Tan's Fish Cheeks,
Mm.
and then Sandra Cisneros, a piece by her, and then a piece lit by Mary Carr, which not every, that piece is a little bit more advanced. But we read these beautiful stories that were really narratives, kind of
Mm-hmm.
verging on memoirs. And then we studied those. And then I had each kid brainstorm 3 different stories that they had in their past. And then they picked one to be interviewed about. Because I said, really narrative is about telling the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's about oral, right? That
Mm-hmm.
you're telling the story to someone. So they got together in pairs, and then they read, or they told their story to the partner. The partner asked them a bunch of questions and they recorded it.
Mm.
And then they went home with the recording and they transcribed everything that they said.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, they pulled out where their story was, right?
Mm-hmm.
And where their story started and
Mm-hmm.
which moment. And then they wrote their story from there.
Mm.
Whereas, like a traditional English class, what I would do is say, let's look at narratives. Now you're going to write your own narrative,
Mm-hmm.
brainstorm, and now start writing.
Right.
Right? Missing that part of allowing them to tell the story,
Mm-hmm.
and missing that part of them actually transcribing their own words,
Mm-hmm.
so they can get the dialogue actually
Mm-hmm.
right, and they can put that down. So if you think about it, Hemingway, Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, right? All of these big canonical authors
Mm-hmm.
that we study, they started as journalists,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So Grapes of Wrath came out of 3
right.
years of research,
Mm-hmm.
right, about the Dust Bowl and talking to people and hearing their voices. So I
Mm-hmm.
think as
Mm-hmm.
much as you can draw that connection
Yeah.
and realize that literature it's really rooted so
Mm-hmm.
much.
Yeah. And it makes me think, how can journalistic elements be adapted into the English language arts curriculum?
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah. I
Yes.
mean, this example of narrative writing is
Yeah.
perfect, or
Yeah.
research writing, or,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the research writing too, right? Like that goes into it. And we had students write argumentatives, but they had to
Mm-hmm.
do research on, and this was in a composition class, they had to do research on an issue they cared about. They needed to interview people about that
Mm-hmm.
issue who were close to it. And then they needed to write an argumentative proposal directed at a person in our community,
Mm.
saying what they thought should change and
I
be
love it.
changed.
Yeah.
So
And I
that's
like to, like when you start bringing in Instagram, let's say, it's, it kind of brings together journalism as I traditionally think of it with,
right,
media
right,
and like media literacy, really.
right,
Sort of
right,
brings those two together really beautifully.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So let me ask you, so as the students have been reading this book,
Yeah.
there's a lot of amazing stuff going on in this book.
Yeah.
And so the students that in my class have been saying that they're inspired, they're sort of a little envious sometimes of some,
Yeah.
and maybe a little bit intimidated or nervous about doing
Right.
some of this stuff in their
Yeah.
contexts. And so I
Yeah.
was wondering if, for fear of pushback or, so I
Sure.
was wondering if you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I've been teaching for 23 years,
Mm-hmm.
and I always have some degree of nervousness,
Uh-huh.
right? Because it's whenever you have, and nervousness isn't bad. It just means that there's something new that you're trying. And I think when you're trying something new, you have to be open to either experiencing some level of success that you haven't had before, or some level of failure and learning that you may not have had before. And I always tell my students, like, you don't have to be perfect, right? That if you stretch and you try something and you take a risk, that's worth it, right? That's part of the process. And I think probably as new teachers that you feel almost this need to be perfect, right? To stay in this box, and that you have to allow yourself and encourage other people to allow you to be imperfect. And sometimes something will end up working and sometimes it won't. But am I nervous about this year and what's going on in our paper? 100%, right? Like, I know kids are going to take on some really tough issues. And I know that probably somebody's going to be mad about it.
Right.
But
So
I guess,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah. But when I do get pushback, I usually get a phone call to my room and they say, Tracy, somebody's in the office and they want to talk to you. And I know that I need to go down there. And then I talk to the adult and I say, okay, let me get my students together. Let me get the writer and let me get the editor, and let's go through the article together or whatever piece they have a hard time with. And let's hear what the students have to say about it. And most often when that happens is that the adults who are upset recognize that the topic really matters to students and they understand why they did what they did. So I think that my recommendation would be always, if you're going towards a student-centered classroom, you have to have a group of students that have that locus of control, and that those are your students. That you can't have a student-centered classroom and say, okay, students are in charge of this publication, but whenever complaints come in, it falls on your shoulders.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right. And that, you have to explain to administration. And there's also, and I honestly I have a website, it's tracyanderson.org, where it has like lesson plans and all of these things. And I'll keep putting up more materials on there, but they're national. I have a dog, but they're national. I'll be right back. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, take your time.
Wait, 1 second. Come on. Come on. Here. Thank you. Okay. But I think what's been helpful to me is to really go back to like the National Scholastic Press Association model guidelines, the state organizations model guidelines, whether it's through NCTE or it's from, a state organization. But as a teacher, and I've always given it to my principals and said, this is what they recommend. And I want to be doing the best practices at the state level and the national level. So I think that is a really important, like, I would recommend for new teachers to get involved and to find national and state guidelines that support where they want to go as a teacher.
Right. And even the premise of this book, the students' rights to read and write, could be a good starting point for that. In fact, another interview with Melissa Horner, she talked about really having some research to point to, whether it's English journal articles or books like this.
Yes.
And Molly too suggested that in her interview was, to have, and then also, maybe I love what you're saying about students, like having students talk to the adults about their rationale for wanting to cover these stories and things like that. Yes. So I'm even thinking as an English language arts teacher, maybe a part of my curriculum development, because I'm not doing a newspaper, let's say, but I'm building a curriculum. Maybe that's in conversation with students.
Right.
And say, hey, we can talk about this, 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 and this.
Right.
So that if stuff does come back, it's like, well, let's talk about why the students wanted to look at this stuff.
Yes. And I do think that when students know that they are going to be speaking on their behalf about why it is that they wrote what they wrote, they have 100% of that responsibility to write fairly accurately, right? Like my students, I always tell them, like, sometimes I'll read what you put in the magazine before it goes to print, and sometimes I read it after it goes to print. So, and I say that to them not because I don't read it before it goes to print, but because I don't ever want them to try to get something past me, right? And have me be that
Right.
Gatekeeper. Like, I
Right.
want them to know, like, if they want to stick a swear word in the middle of an article, well, they'll be able to do that. They can get that past me.
Right. Right. Right.
But they don't do it because they have 100% of the
Yeah.
power that's there.
That's responsible journalism.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
I love
Yeah.
that. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fantastic. So
Yeah.
let me just switch gears a little bit. So talk to me about like your professional writing. I mean, you've mentioned you have this book chapter. You've mentioned that you sort of implied that you've done some other professional writing. You
Yeah.
have a website that you
Yeah.
put together. And so, my class is full of English teachers around the
Yeah.
country who are doing
Mm.
amazing work, who very few other people know about, other than the people in
Right.
this class, maybe, and their
Right.
colleagues at the building. And so I'm
Right.
like, let's talk about writing this stuff up.
Right.
So
Right.
what thoughts do you have about that, or what effect has this professional writing or creating a website had for
Yeah.
you, or
Yeah. So I wrote a lot in like the 2000s.
Mhm.
And I worked on a book about spelling with Becky Sipe and a couple of other teachers. And then I worked on another book called Purposeful Writing.
Mhm.
um, and it was just co-authored with Becky, where she would come into my class, and it was about kind of choice in a workshop classroom.
Mhm.
And then but those are both under a name from when I was married. And then now I'm back to my maiden name. So it was under Tracy Rosewarne. And then I got into journalism. And
Mhm.
once I went into journalism really hard, it took a lot of time. So I've been doing it for 20 years, but I've really pulled back from professional writing
Mhm.
until this past year, when
Mhm.
I started with Molly doing this book, and
Mhm.
then really kind of getting back into it with the website. And
Mhm.
I think that when I'm writing about my teaching and practice, that I'm a better teacher.
Mm.
And then also I'm just at the point where I'm coming closer to the end of my career,
Mhm.
and I feel like I have like Donald Murray's book, Writing to Deadline, is
Mhm.
this old book that he wrote, but it was about journalism. And I think a long time ago, I was talking to Heinemann, and I was like, to really do like journalism and this nonfiction track is an important way to go. I mean, I really
Mhm.
think that that is missing
Right.
from the English teaching as a profession,
Mhm.
and that it is it's a shame, right?
Mhm.
And I've spent 20 years really developing and honing and understanding that aspect of writing that's
Mhm.
so important to kids. I mean, when
Yeah.
they get to college, like, nobody is saying to them, right, like, outside of a poetry class, like,
Mhm.
I'd really love for you to write me a poem, right? And it's kind of strange too, right? Because and I teach poetry and I teach
Mhm.
creative writing, but we spend way more time on poetry and creative writing than we do on teaching kids how to care about something and
Mhm.
to write an argument and put it out in the world, as you
Mhm.
would do in an editorial, right, or an
Mhm.
opinion piece.
Right.
And that is such an important skill
Mhm.
that I think we're missing out on.
Yeah, so I appreciate you going down this path, because so this is a class called Teaching Literature,
Yeah.
but one of the questions we have is, ought we be teaching literature, or to what extent ought we be teaching
Yeah.
literature? I
Yeah.
don't take that for an assumption. I want to
Yeah.
challenge that assumption. And so I'm curious, in whether journalism, English, like, what do you having students read? Are you
Yeah.
having them read in these genres you're asking them to write in, and.
Yes,
Mhm.
100%. So, I mean, reread it, and honestly, from like if you look at the front page of the New York Times now, right, it
Mhm.
really takes a narrative approach.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean that line between? I mean, it's nonfiction, but
Right.
the techniques and the writing
Right.
techniques are the same.
Mhm.
And I look at some pieces, from the New York Times. I mean, how can you take a Pulitzer Prize winning piece of journalism and not say that it's literature,
Mhm.
right? So that that we read all of the time.
Mhm.
And yeah in
I love it,
yeah
because one of the debates we've had in class is, what is literature? What
yeah, and I think that's a
constitutes
good
literature?
debate.
Yeah.
It's a good debate.
Mhm.
It's a good debate to have.
Mhm.
Yeah. And
Nice.
even like right now I'm struggling, not struggling, but there's a challenge in my creative writing class where we do read more literature and do more writing, but I'm working with students of how do we get their work out there into the world. So we're going to
Mhm.
create a book, we're going to develop out and create an online site where
Mhm.
they'll be able to read their creative writing, where they'll be able to put it up. Maybe we'll do something on Instagram, but I'm going
Mhm.
to pull them into the conversation, because that's the other thing, is that I can't alone create a website and sustain it.
Mhm.
I can't manage the Instagram. So I have
Right.
to empower kids to think about, what is it that we could do together,
Mhm.
right? How could we put your words out there?
Out there. Mhm.
Not all of your words,
Right.
but how could we help you develop your writing voice
Yeah.
to go out there a couple
Mhm.
times during the semester in a real way?
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Have you heard of Insta Poetry?
No, but I should look
It's
at it.
yeah, look it up. I had a student last semester do a project on that. It's just using Instagram to share poetry. And
Yeah,
it's like a very particular way in which people are doing it. It was really interesting.
I'll look at that.
Yeah,
I'll look at that.
yeah.
Yeah,
So this, I'm gonna just ask. So are you? So I know that there's an NCTE session. Will
there
you
is.
will you be at NCTE this year or?
I am taking, and this is the other problem, is that NCTE is the exact same weekend as the National Scholastic Press Association conference.
Mm,
So I will be in DC with 38 high school students.
nice. That's great. That's great.
And that's the other thing. Like, I take my high school kids to the national conference,
Yeah,
and
and they're part of the presentations and learning the stuff and
they go and they learn the stuff,
yeah.
right? So I take them all around DC, but they go and they're taught by
Hmm.
other advisors
Right.
and professionals in DC, and it's a wonderful experience.
That's
But
nice.
I mean, it's just strange that it shows you how disconnected journalism is from NCTE
Yeah,
and the
that they're
English
happening at the
teachers,
same week.
that they're happening the same weekend, and they happen on a regular basis
Hmm.
the same weekend.
Yeah, that's
So
interesting.
no, I would love to be there. And I was kind of, I put it out there. It's like, we should do this. And then I was like, oh,
It's the same thing.
but I
Right
would
on.
love to be there,
Right
but
on.
I can't.
Yeah.
38 kids in DC.
Yeah, exactly. You'll be busy.
I
You'll
will.
be busy. Yeah. So thank you so much for taking the
Yeah.
time to talk to us.
Yeah. And if you guys have any questions, you can reach out, or you can email me, or, my
Okay.
information's on that site, but don't hesitate. And honestly, I will say this, is that it is always a challenge. It's always a state of growing and trying to figure something out, if you let it be.
Hmm.
So it's worth it. It's
Right
worth it.
on.
It's worth
Right
it to find those ways. So thank you so much.
on.